Here we go. I didn't think it was recording. We are recording now. Hi, I'm Tracy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle. Welcome.
And we're so excited to be here with Debra Corey, who's somebody I've followed for a long time, recently got a chance to chat with her, be a part of her new ebook. And I'm a big fan of her work, and she's done lots of cool things. She's a speaker, author, expert in lots of areas of employee engagement. So we're thrilled to have her here. So if you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself, Debra, that would be great.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been listening to all your podcasts and they're fantastic. I was a bit nervous though, because you guys throw amazing questions at people, but I'm ready. I am ready. I think the easiest way to describe myself is I've had a couple different parts of my career. I started out traditional HR, comp and benefits, doing that, and I've evolved into other areas of HR. And then I'm sort of in my next phase, which I call my pay it forward phase, which is where I'm taking all the things that I've learned and all the things I continue to learn, because I absolutely love learning. I'm constantly researching, which is how Tracy and I met when I interviewed her, and paying it forward through doing things like this, writing, speaking, consulting, whatever. So yeah, this is phase 2 of my career. Who knows what's next?
Awesome. That's great. And I love seeing what you're doing, and it's so cool. And I followed your journey for a little while now. So let's talk a little bit, and I'm sure we'll go in many different directions, but let's talk a little bit about values and your work in values and the role that they play in companies, in the HR community. And let's talk a little bit about that and go from there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So my second book that I wrote was on employee engagement, and there was a model called the Engagement Bridge with 10 elements. And I've said that I'm going to write a book on each of the 10 elements. So luckily, my first book was on communication, so tick. And my next book I just wrote was on values. And the reason I wrote a book on values is that when my book came out and I was touring the world, I had so many questions on values. Every time at the end, the Q&A, there were so many people who had questions about, what are the right values? How do we embed our values? And then I read some data from Gallup that said only, I think, like 1 in 4 people know what their values are. And of those, only like 1 in 4 know what they mean and use them. And that was my main driver for writing the book, because, I'm sure for you guys, that your values are sort of that roadmap to be able to achieve, your objectives and your purpose and your mission. And so if people don't have that roadmap out, there's going to be a lot of lost people in organizations.
So what are some of the most common questions? You tossed out a few of them. So what are the questions and what are the solutions that you gave people, or you would tell people?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to discover what the right values are for your company. I'm doing a couple projects right now with companies, and it's like night and day, the businesses, and it's really trying to get values that are actually going to help you achieve your purpose. So for example, one organization I'm working with, they've got some challenges. It's such a diverse company. And right now, people aren't necessarily collaborating. They don't necessarily respect what different areas of the business are doing. So for me, the values and the behaviors have got to be things that are going to help overcome some of these challenges and create the culture that every single person in the business, wants. And I'm sure both of you have seen that in your companies with different types of values that you've had.
Yeah, we really try to live our values. Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually took them for granted earlier in my career. I worked for a company that was all about values, and I enjoyed it and I liked it, but I thought it was a little hokey back then. And everybody worked so well together because the values were so prevalent throughout the organization. And the company just did fantastic. They were growing. They always celebrated success. Everything was wrapped around the values. And then I went to a company that didn't have values, and it was very drab, and nobody enjoyed working there, and nobody, as you said, worked well together. And I talked to the CEO about, I think we need to do a values project and put some values in place. And it was then when you don't have the values that I felt like I then realized how important they were to an organization when I didn't have them, because I kind of took them for granted at the company before.
Yeah, definitely. What were you going to say, Trace?
Oh, I forget, which happens a lot, but here's another question that's better. So it's one of those, it's 2020. So here's a different question. Do you think values should change periodically? And if so, when? Because that's something we're struggling with, and should we change?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I did address that in the book, and I gave an example of a company where they did change their values. And I think that in most situations, I'd say the answer is no. You might want to change the behaviors slightly, but if there's a value that, again, if you think about why you have them, they're to help you achieve your purpose and your mission. If you don't have values that are helping you do that, or you have ones that are getting in the way. So one company I interviewed, they had, it was a startup, and they had a value about, owning things and, getting out there and doing it. And what they found is as they got bigger, actually it was the wrong behavior, and they needed to change it into something more about, own it, but collaborate. So I think if it definitely is tripping you up, then change it. But, we haven't spoken about it yet, but as you know, values, the key to the values is embedding them and living them. So if you spend all this time embedding and living them, you don't want to go backwards unless you really, really have to. So I would say, that being said, right now with the world changing so much, if there was ever a time to take a step back and think about, is there something that is more important now? So, right now, everyone is about thank goodness, kindness, compassion, diversity, all these really important things. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's companies who don't have that as part of their values. They either make it a value or embed it in the behaviors, hopefully.
Right. Something we're facing now as we go through strategic planning, which we decided to do in the middle of COVID because we want our team to think like a startup, and we're a very kind of traditional, been around a long time, customer facing, in-person type of business, and we wanted our people to think differently and think really outside the box and really have a growth mindset and develop that. And that's hard. So as we go through that process, a lot of things came up, particularly with my team, looking at the people side of things. And one of our core values is entrepreneurial. And so we have 600 people, we have 45 locations, and we really try to as much as possible to let each location function like a little company. And that gets harder and harder as we get bigger and bigger. And it came up a lot in that, if we do this, does it change our entrepreneurial spirit too much? And so I'm curious on your thoughts on that. I know that you don't know the company super well, but that's something that we're struggling with. How do we keep that? But because we love that as a value, but how do we keep that and move forward?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I remember when I interviewed you for the book, you were talking about that, and I really liked how, especially with the pandemic, you let all the different businesses do what was right. And I think that's a perfect example of how the ethos of it doesn't necessarily need to change, because what I love about it, it's about really understanding what's right and taking responsibility and taking ownership and really feeling like you own that business. So every decision that you make is ultimately right for the business. And I love that, but the behaviors might be different, similar to the example I said with the other company. It might be about, it's okay to take that responsibility, but we want you to think of the larger implications. We want you to think about, if you do this, how is that going to impact the wider business? Or how am I going to leverage it? Had an example, I used to work for Gap, the clothing company. And this was ages ago. And I remember we had a conversation about the businesses were very much running independently, Gap, Banana Republic, and Old Navy. And then all of a sudden, I don't know if they were in a meeting once or what, they all of a sudden realized that each and every one of them was ordering their own denim, which made absolutely no sense because they were all making products with denim. But each of the businesses were going out and buying them because they were thinking, as one individual business. And then we changed it. We're like, okay, you can all buy the same denim. That way you get better prices, you get better service, you can deliver better products to the customer. But it was a flip. And what does that mean? So you still own your individual business, but now let's see if there's any types of, crossovers to leverage each other. And I think that was a great aha moment for us in the business.
That's fascinating too, as a previous wearer of all three brands at various times. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So if we go ahead, Michelle. I had a lot of coffee today, so I'm just going to keep going. Drink a lot of coffee already. So
it's later in the day.
Here.
I think I'm up to 4, so I hope I'm ahead of you guys. Who knows?
You're definitely ahead.
I'll be catching up
not
soon.
For long. Not for long.
I have a couple of questions. So, I always I'm fascinated with values, and I always think about how lucky startups are to have that opportunity in the beginning to set the values, and they've got nothing else, right? That's the foundation. But how do organizations, Tracy's talking about her organization's much larger, and they're all in different locations, and they run a little bit differently. How do they come together and set values and then make sure that those are then lived throughout the organization when it's such a larger organization and people are all over the place?
Yeah, Gina, it's really interesting because I've done projects for bigger organizations, and it always surprises me because I've worked for huge companies before, and actually that there's more similarities than dissimilarities. So I think, getting the values and behaviors, again, to me, that's not the hard part. It's ending up with what do they actually mean? And that's where you have the huge differences. And I think it's a good exercise to do at your company, whether you're creating values or if you have them already, is, do an exercise where you all sit down and you talk about what does the value mean at the company level? What does it mean at the team level? And what does it actually mean to me? Especially now with what we're going through right now, I would probably interpret my values in a different way. And to me, that's where the magic happens, is when you start looking through those different lenses and you start interpreting them and you start actually realizing what they mean. So like my company is only me, myself, and I. But considering I was writing a book on values, I thought I better come up with values. And it's the right thing to do anyway. So one of my values is opening the door to possibilities, and my other is creating magic. And it keeps me on track. But during the pandemic, it took me on a different path, a completely different path. So opening the door possibilities was why I wrote my ebook, because I thought I need to open different doors. I need to create magic in different ways. So I guess going back to your question, big company, small company, to me, it's more about getting them out there, talking about them. And then I'm sure we'll talk more about embedding them, but that's the huge part. The big part of the exercise is embedding them and then living them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that.
Let's
talk about embedding your values. And that's something that I think we do a decent job at, but I bet we have a whole lot to learn. I know we have a whole lot to learn because I've read your book. So
yeah, I think every company does. And it's interesting because I mentioned I'm working with one company and they really want to change the culture of the company through their values. And I keep telling them that's where we're going to need to roll up our sleeves and start doing the work. And I guess my starting point, probably because I started in compensation and benefits and I'm very analytical, is just to map out all the different touch points. So when are the different times that the organization and the people have those experiences, and how can I use the values? So, in the book, I broke it into, topics like, okay, let's start from the recruitment process. Then let's talk about onboarding. Then let's talk about recognition, and really map it all out and think about formally and also informally, how can you embed your values? And then the reason I wrote this special ebook also is that people have been using their values in so many more ways during the pandemic. So half of the story with each company, and you know this, Tracy, is that I said, how are you living your values with your people? But then also, how are you living it with the wider community? As a matter of fact, I'm just practicing a talk I'm doing, and you'll be happy to hear, Tracy, that I have a slide where I mention your virtual 5K that you're doing for the community, which is to raise money for the community, and how that lives your values. So I think it's really important to live your values, not just with your people, but the wider community. How are you treating your customers through your values as well? Really important.
Right. No, that is super important. It's super important to us. And we're, you know, our values we love, but that's something I think a lot about as we look at, we've developed a purpose that we're refining, and do the values still fit in? So I think that's really interesting. So what you talked about is really embedding it along the whole employee experience, the entire employee experience.
Absolutely. So that they become a part of, my son taught me this term, muscle memory. Supposedly it's a gaming term. I don't know. So that when you're playing your computer games, your hands just, you know, do it for themselves. And in my book, I shared a story about my muscle memory as a gymnast, and how years after I stopped doing gymnastics, I got hit by a car. And as I was flying through the air, my muscle memory took over. And instead of crashing on my head, I did a front flip, and that's right, you can see me. And I did my Olympic landing. But I share that story only because that's what you want your employees to do as they're flying through the air. You know, if they can't remember the words, who cares? But they remember the sentiment of what you need to be doing to help them be successful in the business. So I like visuals.
Me too. Me too.
I was working on a project. I was working on building some diversity and inclusion training, which was great. And I was talking to one of the inspiring women in our HR Rebels group, and about the training and what am I missing and what do I have to think about. And the first thing she said is it has to fit your culture. It has to fit your values, and you have to start there, and it has to work for your values. And it was like, you know, I started building the training and just thinking, okay, I have to get this training done. And I just loved that message of, you know, take a step back and think about what's your values, what's your culture, and then start to build what works for that instead of just building a canned training. So yeah. I love embedding it in different things. I think that's great that you were talking about making sure it's prevalent throughout everything you do.
Well, it's interesting. One area that always surprises people when I tell them how I embed them is I did a global benefits project when I first joined a previous company. And when I came up with my strategy, the starting point was the values. And they're like, well, why do you need your values for that? And I said, because too often I've seen companies where, I don't know, for example, you've got a value about togetherness or team. And then you look at the benefits, and the most senior people get, I don't know, 30 days of vacation a year. And then the more junior people get 20 days a year. And it's like, how is that one team? How is that togetherness? So, you know, I'm a real fan of really challenging every single thing you do and saying, are you actually living this value? Because if you can't live the value, then it shouldn't be your value. And that's one of my tips that I always share is it needs to be actionable. And if you're not willing to live it, your employees are going to think you're disingenuous. They're not going to engage with it. They might not even want to work for you because you're saying one thing and doing something else.
Love that. I don't know. And I brought those who watching this on YouTube can see that. That's why I went off camera for a second, that Debra's book. So I don't know if we talked about the Rebels, but I know that's a term close to your heart. So we have a group of people now really around the world that join in for weekly calls. We have a Slack channel, and we just think of HR differently, at least differently than it was, differently than it still is in a lot of places, and really with a people first focus. So I think that's, I don't know if we talked about that. So I think that's something that Michelle and I get a lot of value out, and out of a lot of joy too.
And I love it because I don't know if I told you this story before, but when Glenn, my co-author, and I were writing the book, and we were coming up with the title, we liked Build It. We knew Build It was good because the book talks about this engagement bridge and building the engagement and that connection. And then the next bit about the Rebel Playbook, we weren't sure. Now, keep in mind, this is 3 years ago. We weren't sure if we should use the word rebel. And we actually went out and tested it with people. We thought, oh, is this going to like make people not want to read it because we're using the word rebel? And, you know, we really want to help change the world, but will people read it or not? And finally, we were like, yes, we want to use that word, because if we don't use it, we're not explaining what we're doing. And then the second funny bit about the book is, so Glenn, my co-author, was the CEO of the company that I worked for, entrepreneur, huge rebel. Whereas I started out as a traditional HR person. I'm an evolving rebel. But the joke was, if we got if we got to the end of the chapter that we were drafting and it didn't make me a bit queasy, because it was like pushing me beyond my traditional realm, then we had to rewrite it. And it was hilarious. It's like, how do you feel, Deb? I'm like, ooh, I'm not feeling too good. Publish it.
Then that's good, right? I love that. I love that spirit, because that's something that I've really tried. I think Michelle has more rebel ingrained in her than naturally than I do. So I'm very reserved by nature. I was very much grew up in the traditional HR, and so that's harder for me. But I try really hard to embrace that now.
I picture Glenn on my shoulder, whispering in my ear all the time. I remember when I worked for him, I was putting in a recognition program, and we had different levels of recognition, and the most entry level was something that you could give somebody like a $10 voucher, $10. And I was getting ready to do what I had always done before, which was there was an approval process. So I wanted to send it to you and it had to be approved. And Glenn's like, we're in the middle of writing this Rebel playbook. What are you doing? And I was like, well, I just want to make sure, it's not the employees I don't trust, it's me. And will I be able to communicate it? And Glenn just cracked up laughing. I'm like, why are you laughing? He goes, Deb, your first book was on communications. You're now writing a book about Rebel. If you can't do it, who is going to do it? You need to do this. So I did. And you know what? Nobody took advantage of it. Everybody understood it. It was such the right thing to do. But yeah, I always picture Glenn on my shoulder.
I've had a lot of experience with that. And now we're going through that with our team, who's some of them have been with the company for a long time. And well, can we just do this? And so I'm trying to encourage everybody to break things and not worry about it and just do things. And so sometimes we run into, but it's all good because it's a learning process, right? So they're learning to break the rules, which we all should.
I did that with our well-being allowance. Also, I put in a well-being allowance, and I didn't really have an approval process. They had to send it to me, but more because I was nosy and I wanted to see what they were using the money with. I remember somebody wrote in and they wanted to use it or they said they bought a refrigerator or wanted to buy a refrigerator with it. And I was all ready to say no to them. And then I thought, why? If that's wellness to them, so they can have nice, healthy food, who am I to decide it? So yeah, right. I wasn't a big fan of approvals, but again, that was more just so I could see what everybody was using it for.
Funny. That's funny. Well, I think we're actually at time, which is absolutely crazy because that flew by. But any final questions, Michelle? Or
I just have a tactical question, and it's more out of curiosity. So I heard or read a long time ago when I was reading about values, that there's a rule of thumb that you should not have integrity as a value, that should just be understood. So I want to ask you, as the expert on values, is that still a rule of thumb, or what are your thoughts on that?
I try not to be black and white to things. So personally, I'm not a huge fan of it, only because it means so many different things to different people. And I think that's the problem with that and other words. There's a lot of other words that are very ambiguous. However, there's a lot of companies I know that have integrity, because going back to what I said earlier, it's so important. And as long as it's really important and you explain it well, then I'm absolutely fine with it. But, again, if you're not going to explain any value, then don't have it. Yeah, I think you do have it, don't you, Tracy?
We do.
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
But you do a really good job of explaining it. So
yeah. We do, and we live it. And it's really, it's one of those things where we kind of don't talk about it as much because we have a no asshole rule anyway, which isn't a value. But if someone violates that core value, they just, you can't be here, right? So it's so important to everything that we do. But yes,
maybe you should change it to that. Maybe you should change your value to be to
no asshole. No, yeah. We're thinking of, and that's something maybe you and I should talk about. We're thinking of how can we make that. Our CEO did a disrupt HR talk last year on our no asshole rule. So we're thinking of how we can kind of incorporate that more.
Well, I know we're out of time, but one last thing, and it's one of my most favorite set of values is in that book you just held up, Build It. Am I allowed to swear on this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because it's an Australian company, so take that with a grain of salt, and it's a tech company, and one of their values is don't be a head. But it's great because it calls people out. You want values that people are going to use as part of your conversation. And, when I interviewed them, they're like, you'd be in a meeting and somebody would be a head and people would say, come on, that's one of our values. So those are my favorite kinds of values, ones that are just right between your eyes.
Yeah, maybe we've got to rethink that now. I do love that. So maybe we do have to rethink that. Well, thank you. I love it. Yeah, I know. I'm still working on it. I try to embrace it, but thank you so much for being here, Debra. I really appreciate it. And we'll link to your ebook and where to find you when we send this out. And hopefully, if you want any last words and where people can find you, we'll link to that. But if you want to share it for the podcast listeners.
Yeah, no, I mean, LinkedIn's probably the best way. And the ebook is completely free. I purposely did it for free. I don't even ask for email addresses because I just want it to help as many people. Stories like yours and other organizations are just so inspirational and helpful right now. So yeah, please share that.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.